The bloodstained designer handbag found abandoned in Dubai's luxurious Al Barsha district would eventually lead investigators to the dismembered remains of Priya Malhotra. But in the 60 days between her gleeful message to her family, announcing she was leaving her husband for Sheikh Khalid al-Rahman, and her gruesome murder, she had lived a life that transformed her from an impoverished domestic worker to a woman adorned with diamonds and paraded at exclusive events as the Sheikh's newest acquisition, a fairy tale that concealed the calculated manipulation and mounting danger behind closed doors. Priya Malhotra had arrived in Dubai 18 months earlier as one of thousands of hopeful migrants from Kerala seeking better wages as domestic workers, leaving behind a struggling husband and aging parents in a small village where the monthly remittances she sent home represented the difference between basic survival and crushing poverty that had defined their existence for generations. Her recruitment agency had placed her with several wealthy Emirati families, where she developed a reputation for diligence, discretion, and an eagerness to please that made her popular among employers seeking staff who would remain invisible, except when needed. The transformation of Priya's circumstances began at a lavish dinner party hosted by a prominent business family, where Sheikh Khalid al-Rahman first noticed her serving quietly and efficiently among the staff, her delicate features and slender figure drawing his attention in a way that would later be described by witnesses as immediately possessive and calculating, rather than genuinely affectionate, though Priya herself had interpreted his interest as the miraculous beginning of a romantic story that would elevate her from servitude to luxury. Within days of that initial meeting, Sheikh Khalid had negotiated Priya's release from her employment contract through substantial payments that bypassed normal labor regulations, installed her in a private apartment near his villa, and begun the process of remaking her appearance through expensive clothing, cosmetic procedures, and intensive coaching on how to behave appropriately in the exclusive social circles where he intended to display her as his companion, though never with any formal recognition or status that might compromise his standing within his conservative family. The messages that Priya sent to her husband Ravi during those early weeks revealed her intoxication with the sudden wealth and attention, combining excited descriptions of luxury items and experiences with increasingly dismissive references to her previous life and growing impatience with her family's concerns about the propriety and safety of her new arrangement, which she interpreted as jealousy rather than legitimate worry about her vulnerability in a situation where she had no legal protections or independent means. The WhatsApp video call in which Priya formally informed Ravi that she was leaving him for Sheikh Khalid lasted less than 4 minutes but destroyed the life they had planned together, as she displayed her new jewelry and designer clothes while explaining that she deserved better than the poverty and struggle he could offer. Ignoring his tears and warnings about the temporary nature of a relationship based on such unequal power and her disposability once Sheikh Khalid's interest inevitably waned. The documentation assembled by Ravi Malhotra after Priya's death revealed the systematic psychological isolation that occurred during those 60 days, as Sheikh Khalid gradually restricted her communication with family, controlled her movements through private drivers who reported directly to him, and created a state of complete financial dependency by providing lavish gifts rather than actual money that might enable her to establish any independence or exit strategy, as his behavior became increasingly controlling and volatile. The investigation that would eventually uncover the truth about Priya's murder began not as a homicide case, but as a missing persons report filed by Aisha, another former domestic worker who had briefly been involved with Sheikh Khalid and maintained contact with Priya out of concern, based on her own experiences with his escalating pattern of isolation, control, and eventually violence when his companions showed any signs of independence or resistance to his demands. The social media posts that documented Priya's transformation showed her progressive adoption of increasingly revealing Western clothing, ostentatious jewelry, and cosmetic enhancements that Sheikh Khalid demanded as part of her new role, creating a digital timeline of her physical metamorphosis that contrasted sharply with the modest appearance and traditional values she had maintained throughout her previous life in Kerala and during her initial months working in Dubai households. The autopsy findings that would later shock even experienced forensic investigators revealed evidence of systematic abuse that had preceded Priya's murder, including healed fractures, cigarette burns concealed under her clothing, and other signs of escalating violence that correlated with Sheikh Khalid's established pattern of behavior with previous women, but had reached unprecedented levels in his relationship with Priya, whose increasing resistance to his control in the days before her death had triggered the final explosion of rage that ended her life. The evidence that would eventually connect Sheikh Khalid to Priya's murder included not only the blood-stained luxury handbag containing her identification documents, but also security camera footage, DNA evidence, and testimony from household staff who had witnessed his escalating violence. Though the process of building a case against a member of an influential Emirati family would require extraordinary dedication from Detective Layla Hassan, whose commitment to justice transcended the substantial political and social pressures to classify Priya's death as a tragic accident or the result of criminal activity by unknown parties. The transformation of Priya Malhotra from domestic worker to kept woman began with a calculated approach by Sheikh Khalid al-Rahman, who had developed a routine for identifying vulnerable women whose economic circumstances and isolation in a foreign country made them particularly susceptible to his combination of lavish generosity and implicit promises of a secure future. Though investigators would later determine that Priya was the 7th such woman he had installed in temporary luxury before discarding or, in 2 previous cases, abusing to the point that required medical intervention and hasty financial settlements to avoid legal consequences. The initial apartment where Sheikh Khalid established Priya was located in the exclusive Dubai Marina district, a 1-bedroom luxury unit that represented an overwhelming contrast to the shared staff quarters where she had previously lived, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering spectacular views of the Persian Gulf, and amenities including a private pool, concierge service, and proximity to high-end shopping districts where she was taken to acquire the wardrobe appropriate for her new status, though always accompanied by Sheikh Khalid's personal assistant, who reported all purchases and interactions directly to him. The psychological manipulation that characterized their relationship was evident from the beginning, as Sheikh Khalid alternated between overwhelming generosity and sudden, unpredictable criticism of Priya's appearance, behavior, or background, creating a dynamic where she constantly sought his approval while becoming increasingly isolated from any support system that might have helped her recognize the dangerous pattern developing or offered assistance when the situation eventually deteriorated into physical abuse. The communication between Priya and her husband Ravi during this period documented her rapidly changing perspective, as her initial messages filled with excited descriptions of luxury and unbelievable good fortune gradually transformed into defensive justifications of her choices. Accusations that he and her family were attempting to deny her happiness out of jealousy, and eventually almost complete silence, as Sheikh Khalid established rules about when and how she could use her phone and installed monitoring software that allowed him to review all her messages. The first physical violence occurred approximately 3 weeks into their relationship, after Priya spoke too long with another guest at a private dinner party, resulting in a bruising grip on her arm that left distinct finger marks documented in photographs she sent to Aisha, with a message minimizing the incident as a misunderstanding and evidence of Sheikh Khalid's passion rather than a warning sign of the controlling behavior that would escalate over the following weeks. The lifestyle that Sheikh Khalid established for Priya included not only material luxury, but also a carefully constructed social isolation, as she was exclusively introduced to his associates and their companions, rather than being permitted to establish independent friendships, attend language classes, or maintain connections with other workers from Kerala who might have provided cultural connection and potential support, ensuring that her entire social and emotional world revolved around his approval and presence. The messages that Priya sent to her mother revealed her growing awareness that Sheikh Khalid's affection was conditional and potentially temporary, expressing underlying anxiety about her future, despite the surface-level descriptions of luxury and excitement, with one particularly revealing exchange occurring after she observed him dismissing a previous companion with nothing but a small cash payment and instructions to leave the country immediately when he had grown tired of her company. The financial control that underpinned Sheikh Khalid's power over Priya became increasingly apparent as he established patterns of generous spending on impermanent luxuries like designer clothing, restaurant meals, and hotel stays, while systematically avoiding any investments that might give her financial independence, refusing requests for education, funding, property in her name, or even a personal bank account that would provide some security if their relationship ended. The investigation would later reveal through credit card records and witness testimony that Sheikh Khalid's expenditures on Priya followed a calculated pattern established with previous women, front-loading the relationship with extraordinarily expensive gifts and experiences that created overwhelming gratitude and emotional dependency, while gradually reducing his generosity and replacing it with criticism and control as the relationship progressed toward its inevitable conclusion when he identified his next target. The turning point that transformed Priya's murder from a private tragedy to an international incident occurred when Ravi Malhotra, refusing to accept the initial dismissal of his concerns by Dubai authorities, leveraged social media and contacts with Indian labor rights organizations to publicize his wife's disappearance and the circumstances surrounding her relationship with Sheikh Khalid, creating public pressure that eventually forced a more thorough investigation, despite significant resistance from influential figures connected to the Al Rahman family. The media attention surrounding Priya's disappearance brought forward other women who had experienced similar patterns of manipulation and abuse from Sheikh Khalid, creating a comprehensive picture of his methodical approach to identifying vulnerable women, isolating them from support networks, establishing financial and emotional dependency, and eventually discarding them when they began to resist his control or when he simply lost interest and identified a new target for his practiced manipulation. The forensic evidence collected from the luxury apartment where Priya had lived with Sheikh Khalid revealed a disturbing timeline of escalating violence, including blood spatter patterns on bathroom tiles that had been professionally cleaned but remained detectable under specialized lighting, indicating multiple incidents of physical abuse that had occurred weeks before the final attack, suggesting that Priya had been subjected to progressively worsening treatment while being kept isolated from anyone who might have intervened or offered assistance. Detective Layla Hassan's investigation faced systematic obstruction from the moment she began pursuing Sheikh Khalid as a suspect, including unexplained reassignment of key forensic personnel, mysterious equipment failures during critical examinations, disappearance of witness statements from official files, and direct pressure from superior officers, suggesting that her career advancement might be jeopardized by pursuing allegations against a member of a connected family. Though her personal commitment to justice, particularly for vulnerable foreign workers, drove her to continue building her case through unofficial channels and carefully cultivated relationships with trustworthy colleagues. The testimony provided by members of Sheikh Khalid's household staff, obtained through Detective Hassan's persistent and careful questioning, revealed a pattern of controlling behavior that had become increasingly volatile in the weeks before Priya's disappearance, with multiple witnesses describing incidents where she had been forbidden from leaving the apartment for days after minor perceived infractions, subjected to humiliating criticism in front of guests, and visibly injured on several occasions that Sheikh Khalid explained as accidents, while instructing staff to ensure she received private medical attention rather than visiting hospitals where her injuries might be documented. The psychological assessment of Sheikh Khalid's pattern of behavior, compiled by a criminal psychologist consulting on the case, identified classic characteristics of predatory narcissism, including his systematic targeting of vulnerable women from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, whose immigration status in UAE made them particularly dependent on his protection. His practiced ability to present a charismatic and generous public persona while maintaining complete emotional detachment from the suffering he inflicted in private, and his expectation of immunity from consequences due to his family connections and wealth. The recovery of Priya's phone records, obtained through Detective Hassan's careful navigation of digital forensics procedures that wouldn't alert Sheikh Khalid's influential connections, provided crucial evidence of her increasingly desperate state in the days before her murder, including unsent draft messages to her husband, expressing fear and regret, searches for women's shelters and emergency visa services, and attempts to contact her former employer about the possibility of resuming her previous position, all indicating her growing awareness of danger and attempts to plan an escape from the relationship. The security camera footage that eventually provided key evidence in the case came not from Sheikh Khalid's property, where all recordings had been conveniently lost due to claimed system maintenance, but from neighboring buildings and street-level cameras that captured images of his distinctive vehicle, leaving his compound at unusual hours on the night of Priya's disappearance, tracking its movement to remote desert areas outside Dubai, where partial remains would eventually be recovered through painstaking forensic search efforts. The financial investigation revealed that Sheikh Khalid had established a pattern prior to each relationship termination, including substantial cash withdrawals, communications with fixers known for arranging rapid departures from the country, and the preparation of legal documents releasing him from any obligations to women he had essentially purchased from their previous employers, suggesting a calculated approach to discarding women when he no longer found them entertaining or when they began to resist his control. The testimony from Aisha, who had herself escaped a relationship with Sheikh Khalid 2 years earlier, provided crucial context about his escalating pattern of behavior, including specific details about his methods of isolation, his explosive rage when faced with any form of defiance, and his network of enablers who helped conceal evidence of abuse, discourage women from seeking help, and arrange quick departures from the country when situations threatened to create public scandals that might damage his family's reputation. The international pressure that eventually forced Dubai authorities to pursue the case more aggressively came through diplomatic channels after evidence compiled by Detective Hassan was leaked to Indian consular officials, resulting in formal requests for investigation from the Indian government, international media attention highlighting the vulnerability of migrant workers in Gulf states, and uncomfortable scrutiny of the preferential treatment often accorded to wealthy individuals in legal matters, regardless of evidence suggesting serious criminal behavior. The recovery of Priya's remains from multiple locations in the desert outside Dubai represented one of the most challenging aspects of the investigation, requiring specialized search techniques, cadaver dogs brought in from international law enforcement agencies, and painstaking forensic work to connect scattered evidence to build a comprehensive case against Sheikh Khalid, despite his family's considerable efforts to obstruct justice through political connections, financial influence, and implicit threats against those who cooperated with investigators. The psychological impact on Ravi Malhotra, who had traveled to Dubai using borrowed money and remained there throughout the investigation, despite financial hardship and implicit threats intended to discourage his presence, was documented through interviews that revealed his evolution from shocked disbelief about his wife's abandonment to determined advocacy for justice once evidence of abuse emerged, transforming him from a betrayed husband to a central figure in bringing international attention to the vulnerability of migrant workers and the impunity often enjoyed by their wealthy employers. The digital evidence recovered from Sheikh Khalid's multiple devices, obtained through complex legal maneuvers that overcame his family's attempts to block access, provided devastating documentation of his systematic approach to relationships, including categorized photographs of previous women, records of payments and termination arrangements, and disturbing messages to associates describing Priya and others in explicitly dehumanizing terms that revealed his complete lack of empathy and his conceptualization of these relationships as temporary ownership rather than human connections. The arrest of Sheikh Khalid al-Rahman created an unprecedented situation for Dubai's legal system, forcing authorities to balance the traditional deference shown to prominent families against growing international scrutiny of the case, which had become a focal point for human rights organizations, highlighting the vulnerability of domestic workers throughout the Gulf region and the systematic failure of legal protections for foreign laborers when crimes were committed against them by citizens with wealth and connections. The legal team assembled to defend Sheikh Khalid employed a multifaceted strategy that included questioning the admissibility of evidence based on technical procedural violations, suggesting that Priya had been involved with criminal elements among the expatriate community who were the actual perpetrators of her murder, highlighting her immoral behavior in leaving her husband for financial benefit, and implying that Detective Hassan's pursuit of the case was motivated by personal or political agendas rather than legitimate evidence. A comprehensive approach designed to create sufficient doubt and controversy to prevent conviction. The forensic evidence presented by the prosecution, established through DNA analysis, time-stamped security footage, telecommunications data, and financial records, a comprehensive timeline that systematically dismantled Sheikh Khalid's claims about his whereabouts on the night of Priya's disappearance, connecting him directly to both the initial assault in his residence and the subsequent transport of her remains to multiple desert locations selected for their remoteness and difficult search conditions. The testimony provided by Sheikh Khalid's former driver revealed critical details about previous incidents involving other women, including specific occasions when he had been instructed to transport injured women to private medical facilities, deliver substantial cash payments following abrupt terminations of relationships, and facilitate quick departures from the country, establishing a pattern of behavior that undermined defense claims that Priya's case was an isolated situation or the result of actions by unknown third parties. The international media coverage of the trial transformed what might have been a quickly dismissed case into a high-profile examination of how wealth and influence could distort justice systems, with daily reporting from court proceedings, interviews with labor rights advocates, and investigations into previous cases where accusations against prominent individuals had been suspiciously abandoned, creating public pressure that made it increasingly difficult for authorities to dismiss or minimize the substantial evidence against Sheikh Khalid. The psychological examination of Sheikh Khalid, ordered by the court, revealed a disturbing combination of narcissistic personality traits, lack of empathy, and calculated charm that allowed him to maintain a respectable public image while engaging in progressively more violent private behavior, with the evaluating psychiatrist testifying that his apparent confidence during proceedings likely reflected his genuine belief that his family connections would ultimately protect him from consequences regardless of evidence. The victim impact statement delivered by Ravi Malhotra described not only his personal loss, but the devastating impact on Priya's parents, whose health had deteriorated drastically after learning of their daughter's fate, and the broader harm to their community in Kerala, where her story had destroyed the hopes of many families who viewed employment in Gulf states as their only pathway out of generational poverty, despite the significant risks faced particularly by female workers in domestic settings. The testimony of expert witnesses on human trafficking and labor exploitation placed Priya's case within the broader context of systematic vulnerabilities faced by domestic workers throughout the region, describing how employment practices that confiscated passports, restricted movement, limited communication with family, and created complete dependence on employers, created conditions where abuse could flourish without effective legal recourse, particularly when perpetrators had wealth and connections that could influence law enforcement and judicial proceedings. The revelation during trial of previous settlements paid to women who had been abused by Sheikh Khalid, discovered through financial investigations that traced payments through complex networks of intermediaries, established a clear pattern of behavior that directly contradicted defense claims that Priya's death was an isolated incident or the result of her own actions, instead revealing a systematic approach to covering up violence through financial arrangements backed by explicit and implicit threats against victims who might consider pursuing legal action. The prosecution's presentation of Sheikh Khalid's communications with associates following Priya's disappearance revealed consciousness of guilt through his careful construction of false alibis, instructions to household staff regarding what to tell investigators, arrangements to have key areas of his property professionally cleaned, and attempts to establish an alternative narrative suggesting Priya had voluntarily left with unidentified acquaintances, all actions inconsistent with innocence and demonstrating calculated efforts to evade responsibility. The defense strategy shifted dramatically mid-trial as forensic evidence mounted, pivoting from complete denial to suggestions that Sheikh Khalid had been present during an accidental death, resulting from rough but consensual activity, had panicked due to potential scandal, and had made the catastrophic decision to conceal her death rather than report it. A narrative undermined by medical evidence establishing extensive pre-mortem injuries, inconsistent with consent, and clear evidence of premeditation in the disposal of remains. The unprecedented nature of the case created significant tension within Dubai's legal establishment, with some officials concerned that properly prosecuting a member of an influential family would set dangerous precedents, while others recognized that international attention made a transparent and just proceeding essential for the Emirates' carefully cultivated image as a modern, law-abiding jurisdiction capable of balancing traditional values with contemporary legal standards necessary for continued investment and tourism from Western nations. The verdict finding Sheikh Khalid al-Rahman guilty of premeditated murder represented a watershed moment in Dubai's judicial history, challenging the traditional immunity enjoyed by wealthy and connected individuals, and signaling potential shifts in how seriously crimes against vulnerable foreign workers might be treated in the future. Though legal analysts noted that the exceptional international attention focused on this particular case made it unclear whether similar outcomes would occur in less publicized situations involving powerful perpetrators and marginalized victims. The sentencing hearing revealed the stark contrast between UAE's theoretical legal framework, which allowed for capital punishment in cases of premeditated murder, and the practical application of justice when defendants came from prominent families, as Sheikh Khalid received a 25-year prison term rather than the death penalty that would likely have been imposed on an offender of lesser social standing, a compromise that reflected both the pressure to demonstrate that no one was entirely above the law and the continuing influence of family connections in determining ultimate consequences. The impact of the verdict on Dubai's international reputation was complex and multifaceted, with human rights organizations cautiously praising the conviction while noting it represented an exception rather than systematic reform, business publications analyzing potential effects on foreign investment and expatriate willingness to relocate to the region, and tourism agencies attempting to frame the case as evidence of functional legal systems, rather than a revealing glimpse into the darker aspects of power dynamics in a society structured around rigid hierarchies of nationality, wealth, and connection. The response from the broader Al Rahman family followed carefully orchestrated public relations strategies, including formal statements expressing shock at Sheikh Khalid's previously unknown behavior, announcements of substantial charitable donations to organizations supporting migrant workers, and behind-the-scenes financial arrangements with Priya's family that combined compensation with implicit expectations of privacy and discretion regarding ongoing public commentary about the case or the family's responsibility for addressing systematic issues that had enabled Sheikh Khalid's actions. The psychological support provided to Ravi Malhotra following the trial addressed not only his grief over Priya's death, but also the complex emotions surrounding her initial abandonment of their marriage, his discovery of the abuse she had suffered before her murder, and his evolving understanding of how economic desperation and power imbalances had created the conditions that made her vulnerable to Sheikh Khalid's manipulation, transforming his perspective from personal betrayal to recognition of broader structural issues that endangered many workers in similar circumstances. The financial compensation eventually negotiated for Priya's family, while substantial by Kerala standards at approximately 600,000 euros, represented an insignificant amount for the Al Rahman family, whose legal team had calculated this figure as sufficient to resolve potential ongoing litigation while inadequate to provide the complete financial independence that might have enabled Ravi or Priya's parents to continue advocating for systematic reforms that would threaten established power structures benefiting wealthy employers of foreign domestic workers. The media coverage following the verdict revealed sharply divergent narratives, with Western publications emphasizing themes of justice prevailing despite privilege, regional Arabic language outlets focusing on the exceptional nature of Sheikh Khalid's actions rather than systematic issues, and Indian press highlighting the continuing vulnerability of the millions of migrant workers from Kerala and other states who remained in potentially exploitative situations throughout the Gulf region, despite the temporary attention focused on a single high-profile case. The diplomatic tensions created by the case illustrated the complex interrelationships between labor exportation, economic dependency, and human rights concerns, with Indian government representatives balancing genuine concern for worker protections against recognition that remittances from Gulf employment represented essential economic support for many regions of the country, creating institutional reluctance to push too aggressively for systematic reforms that might reduce employment opportunities despite continuing risks for vulnerable workers. The response from advocacy organizations focused on leveraging the temporary international attention to push for structural reforms, including enhanced monitoring of employer compliance with labor regulations, improved access to legal support for foreign workers experiencing abuse, modified visa structures that would reduce absolute dependency on individual employers, and strengthened capacity for consular intervention when citizens reported concerning situations, though implementation of such measures faced significant resistance from entrenched interests benefiting from the status quo. The psychological assessment of the broader impact on domestic workers throughout Dubai revealed widespread fear combined with necessary pragmatism, as many women in situations similar to Priya's initial employment recognized the dangers illustrated by her case, but remained economically unable to reject potentially dangerous positions, instead developing enhanced informal networks for sharing information about particularly risky employers and supporting each other through underground communication channels that would not trigger employer monitoring or retaliation. The legislative changes proposed in response to the case reflected careful political calibration, with modest adjustments to monitoring and reporting requirements, creating an appearance of reform while preserving fundamental power imbalances, including continuing practices of passport confiscation, restricted movement, limited communication rights, and practical barriers to legal recourse that maintained employer dominance, despite theoretical protections that existed primarily in official publications rather than practical implementation. The long-term psychological impact on Detective Layla Hassan illustrated both the professional consequences of challenging power structures and the personal toll of immersion in such a disturbing case, as her role in securing the conviction resulted in both subtle, professional marginalization through assignment to less significant cases and persistent nightmares focused on evidence she had reviewed, particularly photographs documenting the progressive physical and psychological destruction of a young woman who had arrived in Dubai with hopes for economic advancement only to be systematically exploited, abused, and ultimately murdered by someone whose wealth had created an expectation of absolute impunity. The appeal process initiated by Sheikh Khalid's legal team demonstrated the continuing advantages of wealth, even after conviction, as they assembled an expanded group of highly credentialed international attorneys, commissioned alternative analyses of key forensic evidence, identified minor procedural errors during the original trial, and leveraged remaining family connections within the judicial system to argue that international publicity had prevented fair proceedings, a comprehensive approach unavailable to defendants of ordinary means and reflecting the persistent inequalities within legal systems even following apparent victories for accountability. The establishment of the Priya Malhotra Foundation by Ravi, using a portion of the compensation funds, created a support system for other domestic workers facing dangerous situations in Gulf states, providing emergency assistance, legal consultation, and temporary housing for women attempting to escape abusive employers, though its operations faced continuous challenges from authorities concerned about activities that might discourage foreign labor or generate negative publicity about treatment of workers who represented essential components of the economy and daily functioning of wealthy households. The psychological evolution of Ravi Malhotra through his advocacy work transformed him from a traditional husband devastated by abandonment to a recognized voice for structural reform, as his personal story of initial betrayal, subsequent discovery of abuse, and ultimate commitment to preventing similar tragedies gave him unique credibility with diverse audiences, ranging from potential migrant workers considering Gulf employment to international human rights organizations seeking authentic perspectives on how economic desperation created vulnerability to exploitation, despite knowledge of potential dangers. The investigation into broader patterns within Sheikh Khalid's social circle revealed disturbing normalization of exploitative behavior toward foreign workers, particularly young women in domestic and service positions, with evidence of shared techniques for identifying vulnerable targets, comparing methods of control, and exchanging advice on handling potential legal complications, suggesting that his actions, while extreme in their ultimate violence, existed on a spectrum of predatory behavior, tacitly accepted within certain privileged networks, accustomed to treating employees as disposable commodities, rather than human beings with inherent rights and dignity. The diplomatic negotiations that followed the case established modest but meaningful improvements in protections for Indian workers in UAE, including enhanced consular notification systems for employment transfers, improved access to communication with family members, and more substantial pre-departure training about legal rights and emergency resources, incremental changes that reflected the complex balance between protecting vulnerable citizens and maintaining essential economic relationships that benefited both sending and receiving countries, despite continuing power imbalances and potential for exploitation. The psychological research conducted with former employees of Sheikh Khalid and similar employers documented common patterns of manipulation that began with overwhelming generosity and apparent concern before transitioning to increasing control, isolation, and eventually abuse once dependency had been established, creating valuable educational materials that helped potential workers recognize warning signs before becoming trapped in progressively dangerous situations without realistic exit options or support systems. The media documentary produced about Priya's case reached international audiences with its unflinching examination of how her murder represented extreme manifestation of systematic vulnerabilities rather than an isolated tragedy, incorporating testimony from other domestic workers, labor rights experts, and former employees of wealthy Gulf families to illustrate how structural factors, including immigration policies, economic desperation, and cultural attitudes combined to create environments where exploitation flourished, despite theoretical protections existing in official regulations. The educational initiatives developed in Kerala's migrant-sending communities represented practical responses to continuing economic necessity, acknowledging that many families would still depend on remittances from Gulf employment, while providing enhanced preparation for recognizing dangerous situations, maintaining essential communication despite employer restrictions, creating emergency response plans, and accessing support resources, a pragmatic approach, recognizing that complete avoidance of such employment remained economically impossible for many families, despite clearly demonstrated risks. The implementation of improved monitoring systems for employment agencies sending workers to Gulf states created modest but meaningful protections, including mandatory reporting of employer transfers, regular welfare check communications with workers, and centralized tracking of complaints that could identify potentially dangerous employers before tragedies occurred. Incremental improvements that reflected growing recognition that sending countries shared responsibility for protecting citizens while maintaining access to essential employment opportunities that supported millions of families dependent on foreign remittances. The psychological impact of the case on Dubai's domestic worker community revealed complex adaptation strategies, including sophisticated information-sharing networks that circumvented employer monitoring, collective development of safety protocols for new arrivals, and emergency response systems operated through informal community connections, necessary survival mechanisms developed by vulnerable workers, recognizing that formal protection systems remained inadequate despite high-profile prosecutions in exceptional cases that attracted international attention, while countless everyday abuses continued without effective intervention. The legislative reforms implemented following international scrutiny enhanced formal protections without fundamentally altering power dynamics, creating improved reporting requirements, increased penalties for documented abuse, and enhanced inspection systems that provided theoretical protections, while practical access to these mechanisms remained limited by restrictions on movement, communication, and legal representation that continued to characterize employment arrangements structured to maximize employer control and minimize worker autonomy, regardless of regulations existing primarily in official publications rather than everyday reality. The follow-up investigation by international human rights organizations 1 year after the verdict documented both modest improvements resulting from temporary attention and disturbing continuation of fundamental vulnerabilities, revealing how systems designed around extreme power imbalances naturally reverted to exploitation once media scrutiny diminished, with worker testimonies describing continued passport confiscation, restricted movement, limited communication, excessive working hours, and inadequate response to reported abuse, suggesting that lasting change would require structural reforms addressing root causes rather than surface-level adjustments following individual high-profile cases. The release of Sheikh Khalid's personal communications through unauthorized leaks during his appeal process revealed disturbing perspectives shared among his social network, including explicit discussions of domestic workers as commodities to be used and discarded, strategic advice on maintaining public reputations while engaging in private exploitation, and casual references to previous incidents resolved through financial settlements and family influence documentation that contradicted carefully constructed public narratives about isolated misconduct and suggested instead a normalized culture of predation among certain privileged circles accustomed to operating without accountability. The comprehensive academic study published by migration researchers documenting the structural vulnerabilities of domestic workers throughout Gulf states provided statistical validation of patterns previously described through individual testimonies, including widespread passport confiscation, affecting 87% of surveyed workers, restricted communication with family, experienced by 73%, limited freedom of movement, reported by 91%, and fear of reporting abuse due to potential job loss and deportation, acknowledged by 84%. Empirical evidence demonstrating that PREA's experience, while extreme in its violence, existed within systematic exploitation rather than representing isolated criminal behavior. The psychological support programs developed for families in Kerala sending members to Gulf employment addressed complex emotional realities, including guilt over economic necessities that required accepting known risks, anxiety about limited communication with distant relatives working in potentially dangerous situations, and complicated grief when exploitation or abuse occurred. Despite awareness of potential dangers, therapeutic approaches recognizing that economic structures creating dependency on remittances meant many families would continue sending members into vulnerable positions, despite increasingly documented hazards. The technological solutions implemented by worker advocacy organizations included secure communication platforms resistant to employer monitoring, GPS, emergency tracking systems disguised as ordinary accessories, and encrypted documentation applications that could securely record evidence of mistreatment, practical interventions, acknowledging that formal protection systems remained inadequate and that workers required independent resources operating outside official channels frequently influenced by employer interests and structured to prioritize economic stability over individual worker safety. The legislative proposals developed by international labor organizations focused on fundamental restructuring of domestic worker employment, including independent visa sponsorship separated from individual employers, guaranteed access to communication and movement, secure document possession, and meaningful inspection systems, with worker confidentiality protections, comprehensive reforms that face significant implementation challenges, given economic and social structures, dependent on maintaining employer control and systematic disempowerment of foreign workers considered essential, but distinctly subordinate within rigidly hierarchical societies. The psychological testimony presented during Sheikh Khalid's appeal hearings from experts specializing in domestic violence and coercive control documented how his treatment of Priya followed classic patterns of isolation, manipulation, and progressive restriction of autonomy, challenging defense narratives about cultural misunderstandings or consensual arrangements by establishing clear parallels with recognized abuse dynamics documented across cultural contexts, and demonstrating how extreme power disparities created environments where exploitation naturally escalated without effective external accountability or realistic exit options. The documentary evidence assembled about Priya's final weeks revealed her growing awareness of danger and increasingly desperate attempts to escape, including unsent messages to family describing fear, contacts with former employers seeking alternative positions, inquiries about emergency shelter services, and attempts to secure her personal documentation efforts systematically thwarted through Sheikh Khalid's surveillance, restricted access to communication, financial control, and ultimately violence, when her resistance to complete submission became evident through small acts of self-preservation, interpreted as unacceptable defiance. The international diplomatic pressure, resulting from continued attention to Priya's case, produced modest but meaningful policy adjustments, including enhanced consular access protocols, improved complaint investigation procedures, and strengthened penalties for documented abuse. Incremental changes reflecting the complex balance between human rights concerns and economic relationships, dependent on labor migration systems that inherently created vulnerability through structural power imbalances despite theoretical protections existing in formal agreements and official regulations. The testimony of psychological experts during policy development sessions emphasized how exploitation naturally flourished within systems designed around extreme dependency, with research demonstrating that isolated workers, dependent on employers for legal status, housing, food, communication, and physical movement existed in conditions where abuse became normalized and resistance appeared more dangerous than endurance analysis, challenging superficial reforms focused on punishing exceptional violence while maintaining fundamental structures that systematically enabled exploitation across millions of employment relationships. The technological surveillance documented in Sheikh Khalid's residence revealed sophisticated monitoring systems tracking Priya's movements, communications, and activities, including cameras in private areas, software monitoring all electronic communications, and tracking applications installed on her phone evidence, demonstrating the calculated nature of his control rather than impulsive violence, supporting prosecution arguments about premeditated abuse, escalating to murder, and contradicting defense claims about emotional provocation or momentary loss of control in what was clearly established as a systematic pattern of escalating domination. The comparative analysis of legal outcomes between Priya's high-profile case and similar situations receiving less international attention documented disturbing disparities, with researchers identifying dozens of suspicious deaths of domestic workers classified as accidents or natural causes despite evidence suggesting potential foul play, alongside hundreds of abuse complaints dismissed without meaningful investigation. Statistical evidence suggesting that the successful prosecution in Priya's case represented an exception resulting from unusual international scrutiny, rather than indication of systematic improvement in protections for vulnerable workers. The testimony provided by former associates of Sheikh Khalid during appeal proceedings revealed disturbing patterns of enabling behavior within elite social networks, including assistance with covering up previous incidents, providing false alibis, discouraging victims from pursuing complaints, and facilitating financial settlements structured to ensure silence evidence, establishing how wealth and connection created protective ecosystems, extending beyond individual perpetrators to include networks of enablers who maintain systems where exploitation could flourish without meaningful accountability, despite occasional sacrificial prosecutions when cases attracted unusual external attention. The final rejection of Sheikh Khalid's appeal affirmed his conviction, while simultaneously revealing continuing privilege, as the appellate court maintained his 25-year sentence despite prosecutors' arguments that similar crimes by offenders of lesser status routinely received capital punishment under UAE law, a decision reflecting how wealth and connection continued influencing outcomes even within apparent victories for accountability, with legal commentators noting that the sentence, while substantial, still represented exceptional leniency compared to typical consequences for premeditated murder in the jurisdiction. The comprehensive reform proposal developed by international labor organizations in response to continuing vulnerabilities identified through Priya's case addressed fundamental structural issues, including visa sponsorship, independent from individual employers, guaranteed communication rights, secure possession of personal documentation, meaningful inspection systems with confidentiality protections, and accessible complaint mechanisms, recommendations that faced significant implementation barriers from economic and political structures, dependent on maintaining systematic disempowerment of foreign workers, despite growing recognition of human rights concerns documented through high-profile cases. The psychological impact on Dubai's domestic worker community, 1 year after the verdict, revealed complex adaptation rather than systematic improvement, with interviews documenting enhanced informal protection networks operating outside official channels, sophisticated information sharing about dangerous employers, emergency response systems developed within worker communities, and practical strategies for evidence preservation, necessary survival mechanisms developed by vulnerable workers, recognizing that formal protection systems remained inadequate despite high-profile prosecutions in exceptional cases that attracted international attention. The financial analysis of continuing economic dependency between Kerala and Gulf employment documented the fundamental dilemma facing potential reforms, with researchers calculating that remittances from domestic workers supported approximately 200,000 families whose economic survival depended on continuing to send members into potentially exploitative situations, despite growing awareness of dangers, creating powerful economic pressure against implementing reforms that might reduce employment opportunities, despite documented risks that occasionally escalated to severe abuse or death in environments structured around extreme power imbalances. The testimonial archive collected by the Priya Malhotra Foundation documented hundreds of experiences, ranging from economic exploitation to severe physical abuse, creating a comprehensive record of how systems designed around extreme dependency naturally produced exploitation across a wide spectrum of employment relationships. Evidence demonstrating that while Priya's murder represented an extreme outcome, it existed within a continuum of mistreatment enabled by structural vulnerabilities rather than representing isolated criminal behavior disconnected from broader patterns affecting millions of workers in similar positions. The psychological assessment of rehabilitation prospects for Sheikh Khalid conducted as part of sentencing review highlighted disturbing absence of genuine remorse or empathy, with prison psychologists documenting his continued externalization of responsibility, persistent sense of entitlement, and apparent belief that his eventual release would be secured through family influence, regardless of formal sentencing characteristics, suggesting that his behavior represented deeply ingrained personality structures rather than temporary. A lapse of judgment amenable to rehabilitation through conventional correctional approaches. The educational materials developed for families considering Gulf employment following Priya's case balanced practical risk awareness with economic realism, providing comprehensive information about potential dangers and protection strategies, while acknowledging continuing financial necessity that would compel many families to accept known risks, despite documented hazards, a pragmatic approach, recognizing that abstract human rights concerns necessarily competed with immediate survival needs in communities where remittance income represented the difference between basic stability and devastating poverty without realistic local alternatives. The technological monitoring system implemented by worker advocacy organizations created decentralized safety networks, operating outside official channels, including emergency alert applications disguised as ordinary social media platforms, encrypted documentation tools for preserving evidence of mistreatment, and anonymous reporting mechanisms connected to international organizations capable of generating external pressure when local authorities proved unresponsive, necessary interventions, acknowledging that formal protection systems remain compromised by economic priorities and social structures dependent on maintaining employer dominance despite theoretical regulations. The legislative reforms implemented in Kerala's migrant protection systems represented modest but meaningful improvements, including mandatory pre-departure training about rights and resources, enhanced tracking of worker placements and transfers, regular welfare verification communications, and emergency response protocols for families reporting concerning situations. Incremental changes, reflecting growing recognition of sending countries' responsibilities, while acknowledging continuing economic necessity that would maintain migration flows, despite documented risks inherent in employment structures designed around extreme dependency and minimal accountability. The psychological research examining vulnerabilities specifically exploited in Priya's case identified systematic targeting of workers from impoverished backgrounds with family dependencies, leveraging economic desperation and cultural expectations regarding financial responsibility to family members as mechanisms that kept workers in progressively dangerous situations despite recognition of escalating risk analysis, demonstrating how perpetrators like Sheikh Khalid deliberately selected victims whose economic circumstances created tolerance for mistreatment that would have been immediately rejected by individuals with realistic alternatives or effective support systems. The comparative analysis of protective services available to domestic workers of different nationalities within Gulf states documented significant disparities, with researchers finding that workers from countries with stronger diplomatic leverage and more vigorous governmental advocacy generally experienced better treatment and more responsive complaint resolution evidence, suggesting that protection often corresponded more closely with sending countries' economic and political importance than with formal regulations, theoretically applying equally to all workers, regardless of nationality or economic status. The final psychiatric evaluation of Ravi Malhotra, conducted as part of the Foundation's ongoing support services, documented complex psychological integration of trauma, with therapists noting his evolution from devastated victim to effective advocate, while still processing complicated grief, combining loss, betrayal, and eventual recognition of how economic structures had created the vulnerability exploited in Priya's case, an ongoing healing process, suggesting that meaningful recovery required not only personal psychological work but also engagement with broader structural factors that had contributed to creating the conditions where exploitation could flourish. The 5th anniversary commemoration of Priya Malhotra's death revealed the dual legacy of her case, combining modest specific improvements in worker protections, resulting from temporary international attention, with disturbing continuation of fundamental vulnerabilities documented through ongoing research, a complex reality reflecting how systems designed around extreme power imbalances naturally revert to exploitation once media scrutiny diminishes, with meaningful transformation requiring deeper structural changes, addressing root causes rather than surface-level adjustments following individual high-profile cases. The comprehensive research report published by international labor organizations 5 years after Priya's case documented both limited progress and persistent exploitation, with investigators finding reduced prevalence of most extreme abuse following enhanced scrutiny, while identifying continuing structural issues, including passport confiscation, still affecting 63% of surveyed workers, restricted communication, experienced by 58%, limited freedom of movement, reported by 74%, and fear of reporting mistreatment, acknowledged by 79%, empirical evidence suggesting incremental improvement alongside disturbing persistence of fundamental vulnerabilities. The psychological evolution documented in Ravi Malhotra's advocacy work demonstrated transformation from personal grief to systematic analysis, with his public presentations evolving from emotional testimony about individual loss to sophisticated critique of economic structures, creating vulnerability through extreme dependency. An intellectual and emotional journey reflects growing recognition that preventing future tragedies required addressing root causes embedded in global economic relationships, rather than focusing exclusively on individual perpetrators or isolated criminal acts, disconnected from broader patterns. The international educational campaign developed by the Priya Malhotra Foundation reached potential migrant workers across multiple sending countries with comprehensive preparation materials addressing both practical protection strategies and systemic awareness, including documentation preservation techniques, emergency communication systems, recognition of warning signs, and connection to support networks' practical interventions, acknowledging continuing economic necessity while equipping workers with enhanced resources for navigating environments where formal protection systems remained inadequate despite theoretical regulations. The technological solutions implemented by worker advocacy organizations created enhanced safety networks operating outside official channels, including emergency alert applications embedded within ordinary communication platforms, encrypted documentation tools for preserving evidence, anonymous reporting mechanisms, and location tracking systems, disguised as standard mobile features, necessary interventions developed by communities recognizing that formal protection systems remained compromised by economic priorities and social structures dependent on maintaining employer dominance despite occasional high-profile prosecutions. The psychological support services provided to families of domestic workers developed sophisticated approaches addressing complex emotions, including guilt over economic decisions, placing loved ones in potentially dangerous situations, anxiety about limited communication with distant relatives, and complicated grief when exploitation occurred, despite awareness of risks, therapeutic methodologies, recognizing that economic structures, creating dependency on remittances, meant many families would continue accepting known hazards while requiring support processing, resulting emotional burdens. The legal advocacy initiatives emerging from continued attention to Priya's case produced modest procedural improvements, including enhanced consular notification systems, improved complaint investigation protocols, strengthened penalties for documented abuse, and expedited processing for emergency visa transfers. Incremental reforms, reflecting growing recognition of systematic vulnerabilities, while acknowledging persistent implementation challenges within systems structurally designed to prioritize employer control and economic stability over individual worker protection, despite theoretical regulations. The comparative research examining outcomes from similar cases occurring after PRIA's prosecution documented disturbing continuation of disparities, with investigators finding that incidents receiving minimal international attention typically resulted in classifications as accidents, limited investigations leading to inconclusive findings, or minor penalties, incommensurate with documented harm patterns, suggesting that meaningful accountability generally required external pressure rather than representing standard operation of justice systems structurally aligned with employer interests despite occasional exceptions when unusual scrutiny forced demonstrable action. The educational materials developed for employers following PRIA's case attempted to address exploitation by promoting ethical employment practices, including communication access, reasonable working hours, appropriate living conditions, and respect for basic dignity intervention strategies, reflecting recognition that, while exceptional violence attracted condemnation, everyday exploitation remained normalized within systems designed around extreme power imbalances and minimal accountability, despite growing awareness of human rights concerns, highlighted through high-profile cases, generating temporary attention. The psychological analysis examining perpetrator characteristics identified disturbing commonalities between Sheikh Khalid and other abusive employers, with researchers documenting patterns of entitlement, objectification of workers, expectation of absolute compliance, and confidence in immunity from consequences, personality traits that flourished within systems designed to maximize employer control while minimizing accountability, creating environments where exploitation naturally escalated without effective external constraints or meaningful consequences below threshold of extreme violence, attracting unusual scrutiny. The legislative reforms implemented in response to continuing advocacy included enhanced inspection systems, improved complaint mechanisms, strengthened penalties for documented abuse, and expedited emergency response protocols. Incremental improvements, reflecting growing recognition of systematic vulnerabilities, while acknowledging persistent implementation challenges within economic and social structures dependent on maintaining fundamental power imbalances despite occasional high-profile prosecutions, demonstrating theoretical capacity for accountability when cases generated sufficient external pressure. The testimony of domestic workers, still employed in similar circumstances 5 years after PRIA's case, revealed sophisticated survival strategies rather than reliance on improved protections, including information sharing, networks operating outside employer monitoring, documentation practices preserving evidence of mistreatment, communication codes alerting family to concerning situations, and emergency response plans for dangerous escalation. Necessary adaptations developed by vulnerable workers recognizing that while high-profile prosecutions occasionally occurred, everyday protection remained primarily self-generated rather than reliably provided through formal systems structurally aligned with employer interests. 10 years after Priya Malhotra's murder shocked the international community and momentarily illuminated the vulnerable position of millions of domestic workers throughout Gulf states, her legacy exists in both concrete improvements, resulting from temporary attention and sobering recognition of continuing structural vulnerabilities embedded within global economic relationships that maintain migration patterns despite documented risks, a complex reality reflected in both enhanced protections for workers whose sending countries implemented reforms following high-profile cases and persistent exploitation within a system fundamentally designed around extreme dependency and minimal accountability. The Priya Malhotra Foundation, established by Ravi using compensation funds, has grown into an internationally recognized advocacy organization supporting domestic workers across multiple countries, providing emergency assistance, legal consultation, educational preparation, technological safety tools, and psychological support, practical interventions, reflecting recognition that while systemic transformation remains challenging within global economic structures dependent on exploitable labor, meaningful protection can be enhanced through targeted resources, operating alongside rather than exclusively relying upon formal systems that remain compromised by competing priorities. The scholarly research examining structural factors that created Priya's vulnerability has produced comprehensive analysis of how global economic inequalities, immigration policies, cultural expectations regarding financial responsibility, and systematic disempowerment combine to create environments where exploitation naturally flourishes, despite theoretical protections, intellectual frameworks that have enhanced understanding of domestic worker abuse as systemic phenomenon, requiring structural approaches rather than focusing exclusively on individual perpetrators or isolated criminal acts, disconnected from broader patterns. The international diplomatic agreements negotiated following continuing attention to cases like Priya's have established enhanced formal protections, including bilateral oversight committees, mandatory reporting requirements, improved complaint mechanisms, and strengthened penalties for documented abuse. Incremental improvements, reflecting growing recognition of sending countries' responsibilities toward vulnerable citizens, while acknowledging persistent implementation challenges within systems structurally designed to maximize employer control and economic efficiency, rather than worker protection, despite occasional high-profile cases demonstrating theoretical capacity for accountability. The psychological transformation documented in Ravi Malhotra through his evolution from devastated husband to effective international advocate represents powerful testimony about possibilities for healing through meaningful engagement, as his initial personal tragedy became foundation for systematic work, addressing root causes and supporting others facing similar vulnerabilities, a journey suggesting that while grief remains permanent, its integration into purposeful action can create meaning that honors victims through prevention efforts, rather than allowing their suffering to become simply another statistic in ongoing exploitation that continues claiming lives despite occasional moments of accountability. The technological safety networks developed following Priya's case now support hundreds of thousands of domestic workers across multiple countries with emergency alert systems, encrypted documentation tools, anonymous reporting mechanisms, and connection to international advocacy organizations capable of generating pressure when local authorities prove unresponsive practical interventions, acknowledging that while formal protection systems have improved modestly following high-profile cases, everyday safety remains substantially self-generated through community resources, operating alongside rather than exclusively relying upon official channels that continue prioritizing economic stability and employer interests. Despite theoretical regulations, the educational materials now provided to potential migrants in Kerala and other sending regions represent pragmatic balance between risk awareness and economic reality, offering comprehensive preparation regarding potential dangers, protection strategies, documentation preservation, emergency planning, and support resources, practical approaches, recognizing continuing financial necessity that maintains migration, despite known hazards, while equipping workers and families with enhanced capacity for navigating environments where exploitation remains common despite incremental improvements following cases that temporarily focused international attention on systematic vulnerabilities. The legislative reforms implemented across multiple jurisdictions following continued advocacy include enhanced consular notification systems, improved complaint investigation protocols, strengthened penalties for documented abuse, and expedited emergency response mechanisms, incremental improvements reflecting growing recognition of systematic vulnerabilities, while acknowledging persistent challenges within economic and social structures dependent on maintaining fundamental power imbalances that naturally produce exploitation, despite occasional high-profile prosecutions demonstrating theoretical capacity for accountability when cases generate sufficient external pressure. The psychiatric literature examining recovery processes for families affected by similar tragedies has identified effectiveness of advocacy engagement as therapeutic intervention, with research documenting how meaningful participation in prevention efforts provides integration pathway for complex grief, combining personal loss with recognition of structural factors findings, suggesting that while individual psychological healing remains essential, addressing systemic causes that create vulnerability can provide important meaning-making opportunities that honor victims through work, preventing similar tragedies, rather than allowing their deaths to become normalized statistics in the continuing exploitation. The international human rights framework addressing domestic worker protection has evolved significantly following cases like Priya's, with enhanced recognition of systematic vulnerabilities and corresponding responsibilities for both sending and receiving countries to implement meaningful safeguards, rather than maintaining systems where theoretical protections exist, primarily in official publications rather than practical implementation, conceptual evolution, reflecting growing understanding that while individual perpetrators bear responsibility for specific crimes, their actions occur within contexts either enabling or constraining exploitation through structural factors that require systemic rather than exclusively individualized approaches. The psychological research, examining employer attitudes, has identified disturbing normalization of exploitation within systems designed around extreme power imbalances, with studies documenting how ordinary individuals without inherently abusive personalities often develop controlling and dehumanizing perspectives when placed in positions of nearly absolute power without meaningful accountability findings, suggesting that while exceptional perpetrators like Sheikh Khalid represent extreme manifestations, their behavior exists on a continuum of exploitation enabled by structural vulnerabilities rather than representing isolated aberrations, disconnected from broader patterns affecting millions of workers in similar positions. The ongoing monitoring of justice system responses to similar cases continues documenting correlation between international attention and meaningful accountability, with researchers finding persistent disparities between high-profile prosecutions generating external scrutiny and routine handling of comparable incidents, receiving minimal public attention patterns, suggesting that while systems demonstrate theoretical capacity for accountability in exceptional circumstances, everyday operations remain structurally aligned with maintaining economic stability and employer interests, despite incremental improvements in formal protections, following cases that temporarily focused international attention on systematic vulnerabilities.